It always talks over me, so I like to give myself just a second to be able to let it do its thing. So, without further ado, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So we respectfully acknowledge that the offices of the CCSA, or the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, are located on the traditional, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have been present on and nurturers of this land since time immemorial. We're very grateful to have the opportunity to be present on this territory. We acknowledge the Indigenous peoples as traditional knowledge keepers and that our greater society benefits from the sharing of Indigenous peoples. Today, each of our regions from which we gather are home to many different Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to be present on these lands. We strive for respectful partnership with all Indigenous peoples as we look to do better to search for collective healing and true reconciliation. So without further ado, we're going to get things started on our webinar today, Understanding Drug Checking for Local Solutions. So I'm going to start with some brief introductions. So if you could put it on the next slide for me. Thank you, Jill. So we have hit a bit of a snag. Our panelist, Jared, we're hoping he'll be able to join us hopefully shortly, but that's okay. We're going to keep right on with our content. So I'm going to start by introducing Tessa Rogers. Tessa is the Harm Reduction Project Manager with P.E.E.R.S Alliance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting health and wellness through harm reduction, education, and support services. Based in Prince Edward Island, her work is shaped by the province's unique landscape, both geographically, as Canada's smallest province, with close-knit rural and coastal communities, and socially, where access, stigma, and service delivery require thoughtful, community-driven approaches. She leads the province's only drug checking service, working to expand access to life-saving information and supports. Her work continues to center on empowering communities and fostering inclusive, safer environments for all. Next, I'd like to introduce David Byres. David is the training coordinator for the BCCSU, that's the BC Centre on Substance Use, the drug checking program. He's worked in drug checking since 2020 in sites around BC and has supported with training technicians and program implementation for many sites and organizations in BC, as well as around Canada. Next up, we have Karen McDonald. Karen has nearly 20 years of public sector experience where she has informed policy and contributed to health systems change. Since 2018, Karen has led the development and implementation of Toronto's drug checking service, a public health and safety program and national authority on Canada's unregulated drug supply. Karen is now responsible for the program's expansion throughout Ontario. She is a director at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto and holds a master's degree in public policy, administration, and law. And last but certainly not least, we have Courtney Harrop. Courtney spent the past decade working in community health, harm reduction, and housing, supporting people navigating substance use and other complex challenges. In the last few years, she has been involved in implementing, distributing drug checking services, along with other harm reduction supports and community development, working with partners to expand access and reduce overall risk in community settings. So please give a warm welcome to our panelists for today. And Jill, you can stop sharing your slides and we'll just bring up all the wonderful faces so we can have a nice little conversation here. So perhaps, if I may, I'm going to ask David just to give us a bit of an overview of what drug checking is. And would love to learn a little bit about, at a high level, what is the practice and how might it differ from other kind of ways that we maybe track or measure trends like urinalysis or wastewater monitoring?
All right, I will do my best to do this on the spot. Hi everyone. As Chelsea said, I am David. My title is the training coordinator, and I work with the BCCSU's drug checking program. So we support drug checking across BC, and I have also supported drug checking across the country. But at the foundation of like what drug checking is the first, drug checking is a function of harm reduction. This is not an isolated practice without the other elements of harm reduction that contribute to supporting people who use drugs, health and well-being. Um, at the core of what we do with drug checking is we are receiving samples from clients in order to support their own decision making about how, if, when, and where to use their substances. So really at the core of the model of drug checking that we all pursue is that this is around a client-centered service. So this is looks very different from wastewater management or wastewater testing, where we're looking at large population levels. We're really looking at individualized conversations and care and conversations around their own substance use. What we also know is really true about drug checking is it's a really beautiful, easy entry point into other harm reduction and substance use services for people who use drugs. We see this time and time again that because drug checking is a very low barrier access, like very low barrier service, that people are then willing to come and access drug checking. And that provides a point of connection to other harm reduction services, allows for conversation about other harm reduction practices using OPSs, SCSs, different harm reduction equipment tools, practices that we can then share with people who are accessing drug checking. And then one of the other really great things about drug checking is it allows us to monitor the consumer end of the unregulated drug supply in real time. There is no alternative that allows us to see what people themselves are using in a real time scenario other than through drug checking. We do get data from drug seizures that happen from police and borders, but that is not necessarily what actually ends up in the hands of people who are using drugs in community. And so drug checking allows us to monitor that in real time. So drug checking happens in a variety of ways with a variety of different technologies. Each provides different pieces of information to try and give us the most fulsome picture we can of what is in people's drugs so that we can provide the best education about what is in those drugs. The purpose of drug checking is never to make decisions on behalf of a person who uses drugs, but to give them information about their drugs, about the unregulated supply, so that they can make informed health decisions for themselves. So depending on the technologies used, we will see different types and pieces of information, and drug checking technicians are highly skilled in translating technical information and providing that to community members in ways that make sense and support their own health decision making.
Thank you,
Uh,
David. That was wonderful. And thank you for also being so gracious to step in and kind of answer that question for us. Does anyone else on the panel want to kind of add to anything David has shared before I maybe ask another question here?
I could just maybe add one additional benefit of drug checking data compared to other sources of data on the unregulated drug supply. So totally agree with everything that David said. You know, the kind of representativeness of the samples that we're checking. These are drugs that people are actually using. The real-time reporting that is available, you know, depending on the tool or technology, you may be reporting results about what's in a sample like in the moment, or it may be like a day or a week later. But a lot of other sources are a lot longer. And of course, like the accessible reporting that we all are committed to. But the other really important thing about drug checking data is that compared to the other sources is that we can report contamination of drugs rather than just combinations of drugs. So when a sample is submitted to a drug checking service, the service user will, if they would like, they can indicate what they bought or got that sample as. And then when we actually analyze the sample, we can determine, you know, say that, for example, they're checking like a heroin sample, and we check it and we determine there's fentanyl in that sample, we can actually report out that heroin was contaminated with fentanyl. Whereas if you're just looking at wastewater or toxicology information from what was in someone's body, or even like drug seizure data where you don't necessarily know what it is that you were checking, we can just in those cases understand combinations of drugs, whereas for us we can actually say like, no, this supply is contaminated with this.
So it sounds like it's very important in terms of being proactive, right? Being able to get ahead of or maybe monitor some of these things that are more emerging that we wouldn't see in some other more retroactive ways of collecting this information. Is that right? Yeah.
I think a lot of that has a lot to do with it. And then when I look at things from also a service provider landscape, it's also allowed us to really strengthen those relationships with other service providers that are providing things that we may not be. So we don't offer overnight shelter, for example, but when we have participants submitting things and we're seeing that there's benzos or we're seeing that there's medetomidine and in their fentanyl and all of these things, we're actually able to proactively also reach out to those other service providers, whether it be a shelter manager or worker, and say, hey, this is what we're seeing on the streets in real time. Maybe this is what your staff could do to kind of prepare themselves for some things that they might see and how that may change how they adjust room checks or protocol or their overdose interactions and interventions. So, yeah, definitely positives.
And a warm welcome to Jared, who is Jill for the time being. So, hello, Jared. Thank you for hopping on, and apologies for a bit of the snag we had there. I actually just had some panelists graciously step in to talk a little bit about what drug checking is. But I was wondering if you wanted to pick up a bit now on our presentation. I know you had some wonderful content developed for us. If you want to kind of pick us up on the technology piece, would that be okay? Wonderful.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, everybody. I will just jump in for the sake of time.
Yeah,
Um,
all good.
so let's make sure you guys can see my screen. All right, can you guys see that?
We can. That's perfect.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna go through this quickly. So sure was talked about a bit of the history of drug checking as kind of a bias for a service, and then changing from colorimetric in a party context with the fentanyl crisis, it became a bit more looked at as an option for determining what's in the drug supply, and using FTIR in Canada has kind of become the most used model for now. And yeah, it's a public health kind of response to overdose and trying to get some empirical data on what's going on. TLDR, people will be taking drugs regardless of what society says or what we tell them or anything like that. So may as well make responses that kind of help create some knowledge. And I think this was all talked about. So what is drug checking?
Sorry to cut you off, Jared. Your slides are not moving. So in case you
Oh
are
my,
hoping that they are, we're still on your title slide.
okay.
There we go. Now they've changed. That's perfect.
Okay, maybe there's a delay. So it should be on a what is drug checking
Yes,
slide.
that's what we see.
Okay, great. Love technology when it works. Okay, so just gonna keep blasting forward. So yeah, just with drug checking, for those who don't know, it's kind of like a co-located service with other wraparound services and things like that. So it's nice that it's, the service user can be welcomed in an environment, and anonymity can be valued or privacy protection at the very least. And then analyzing the substance using various technologies. And then the results are kind of discussed with service subject matter experts and kind of question and answers. And it's a really nice opportunity to connect and talk about illicit drugs because we don't get that chance very often between provider and person as much. So and then, yeah, the person can walk away being more informed of what's going on. So there can be community-based drug checking services, like in cities and whatnot. There can also be like event-based, like festivals and gatherings. So just going to quickly touch on what drug checking is not. So it's not employment drug testing. It's not urine screening. So it's not, drug checking is not punitive and provides information back to the service user. So drug checking tests drugs, not people. And then just touching briefly on wastewater surveillance. So although wastewater surveillance is an emerging process, does provide interesting data on the right use cases, it differs from drug checking in that drug checking tests specific substances, typically pre-consumption, and is not just extractive. There's kind of that like exchange of information and knowledge with the person. So consensual user submitted samples is drug checking. It's not just an extractive kind of passive process. And what technology is used for drug checking. So just touching briefly. So the tiers of technology, so there's three. So the first is kind of cheap and accessible, technology that anyone can kind of learn to use. Tier 2 is a bit more complex, and Tier 3 is more complex beyond that. So I'll just touch briefly for the uninitiated. So just Tier 1 includes like immunoassay test strips. So that's like the fentanyl strip test. So that one is quite sensitive to the presence of fentanyl. There's also benzodiazepine strip tests and xylazine strip tests. So there's new ones coming that determine a binary yes/no if the analyte is there. And they're quite sensitive, so they're still very useful and cheap and accessible. So these are good things. But then moving on to tier 2, so this includes more spectroscopy. So this is just like FTIR or Raman or SIRS spectroscopy. And typically the limited detection is about 5%. And it can determine the bulk ingredients and major cuts of samples. So FTIR is kind of the main workhorse that's used in a lot of different areas, although there's some other spectroscopy that's we're learning more and more about. So it's really helpful to be able to determine what the main cuts or buffs are, or as well determining active ingredients. And sometimes it can be semi-quantitative. So quantitative models are possible. And then there's tier 3. So this is more like benchtop instruments. These can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. This can require like a chemistry department to help run properly, or a hospital. So a team of experts to kind of make sure it's working correctly because it is so sensitive. But the benefit of tier 3 is that it allows for very high sensitivity and quantitative data. So especially in the area of down and opioids, it allows for quantifying trace substances like carfentanil or fentanyl and various analogs and things like that. So this does provide an extra step of knowledge, but it is quite involved. And then just to touch briefly on the changing legal landscape. So federal exemptions was one path in the beginning. So from the CDSA, there's Section 56 exemptions that are quite tedious and need to be applied for, and Karen is quite knowledgeable on that. And some provinces still very much rely on that, but through time, the federal government delegated authority to provinces to enact things called urgent public sites. So each province can now, through the medical health officer, designate UPHNS sites, which allows for drug checking. So in theory, if the province really wants to champion drug checking, they can get these exemptions operationalized much faster than relying on a central federal government to approve individual case-by-case exemptions. And yeah, so like BC is a good example. So there's lots of exemptions being used in the province of BC, and this allows for interesting models like the distributed drug checking service model to allow for collection, transport, and storage of drugs. And I know the federal exemptions can too, but they can be quite bulky and unwieldy. Oh, Chelsea, are you saying something?
Yes, we still see your what is drug checking slide.
What?
I know,
Okay.
I don't know what is happening, but
Guys, it's
had
a cursed day
messaged
for
it.
me.
It is it is. I know. I'm so sorry, folks.
Okay. Well, I'm going through a nice presentation. Maybe I'll share my slide deck after if people want to
Yeah,
see it.
we'll definitely do that. We'll share the slide deck with folks so that you can have a copy of that. So we do
Okay.
see the legal landscape now, though. We can see your exemption slide.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I'm going to switch that slide. Now we're going to look at a map. Maybe we'll all look at the same map. Who's to say? Uh, But yeah, this is the CCSA's map of drug checking services across Canada. So it's not inclusive or like fully representative, but you can see across the country there's uptake on drug checking, and there's lots of membership with the drug checking working group, and it allows for a nice collaboration and sharing of information. Uh,
I know
yeah,
we just
so
added in the chat, Jared, the link to our drug checking working group, so folks can take a peek at that. Jared, myself, and our wonderful colleague Julie Meeson are the co-chairs for this group. And so if folks are interested, if you kind of meet the criteria, you are welcome to join that as well.
sweet. Okay, that was a hectic presentation. I hope everyone took something away from it, but I will pass it on to the next speaker.
That's all good. Thank you, Jared. And as our wonderful tech person says, it's just that, your slides are being delivered by carrier pigeon. It takes a little bit longer, so that's okay. You can stop sharing your slides, and we're going to move right into some panel stuff. And we're actually on time. So believe it or not, Jared, you made really great use of that. So thank you. So for our panelists, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you all turn your cameras back on because we can't see you. And then we will get started. So the first question I'd like to pose to Courtney. So Courtney, I know you're joining us from BC. And maybe I'll have you and David tag team this a little bit. But I'd love to understand a bit more about what drug checking looks like in your province. Specifically, how are the services delivered and in what kinds of settings are they being delivered in?
Well, that's a big question. BC is a big province, but we do have a lot of communities. David probably knows an exact number who are operating drug checking services utilizing FTIR technology. That's happening in urban settings, rural and remote settings, overdose prevention sites, supervised consumption sites. There are some mobile drug checking services in the more mid and northern areas of the province. So there's some mobile services that kind of move around. Yes, David shared a map of drug checking services in BC. So that's a really cool thing too, is you can look at that map and it will show you where and in what communities people can access drug checking services.
Awesome. And
Yeah.
David.
Across BC, like we have drug checking in a lot of different spaces. We have drug checking happening in pharmacies, in supervised consumption sites, and OPSs, in community organization spaces, in mobile vans on university campuses, in supportive housing, at festivals, during pop-ups for events like Pride, for New Year's Eve, anytime we know that there's going to be a big party. Um, because, as Jared mentioned, we have a very simple system within BC of getting exemptions. We can get exemptions really quickly and we can put them up for pretty much any space that we can imagine that has walls and a roof. And so as long as we can get electricity, walls and a roof, or even sometimes not even walls and a roof, sometimes just a tent. But as long as we can get electricity to run our equipment, we will provide drug checking in those spaces. It is super important just to acknowledge, like in BC, we are unique. My team at the BCCSU is supported directly by our provincial government to support the service delivery across the province. And so our team at the BCCSU exists truly just to support our service providers who offer drug checking in the province through guidance, data, and training. And so we do have that unique ability to be able to set up drug checking in a lot of spaces that may not otherwise be possible. And it's just a very exciting time to be able to provide and be out there in community.
Absolutely. And thank you both for those responses. I think it's interesting to see, and you're going to get a taste of this as we move through our panel, but just how varied the practice is across the country and the way in which it's funded or delivered or offered in these services. It does look very different across regions. So perhaps on that note, I'm going to take it all the way to the other side of the country, the other coast, and I'm going to ask Tessa, who's joining us from PEI, to talk a little bit about what drug checking services looks like in the province.
Yeah, I think in PEI it's very unique in the case that we are a very small island. We can drive from tip to tip of the island in 3 hours, so very small. Our provincial government did apply for the urgent public health, or they had the exemption and they gave us the urgent public health needs site exemption. However, we do exist in a fairly conservative environment. So we've often had to balance what we are doing. When we were first starting to operate the service or first signed on to operate, it was to operate a integrated model where drug checking was part of a supervised consumption site, part of a service hub, and we quickly had to pivot in order to just offer drug checking services with no supervised consumption and no drop-in service at the time. So over time, we've kind of needed to develop and ebb and flow as we do in the harm reduction world. And what we do now is still a hub and spoke model. So my team, our outreach team in Charlottetown, and usually rurally, we don't really know what's happening there in this new funding cycle, but would hold an exemption as well to be able to transport substances back to our hub in Charlottetown, where myself and thankfully now a second drug checking technician can run samples and get that information back out to participants. We do run peer-to-peer programming, and we were able to kind of use wording that allowed us to be more front-facing, where we do offer a satellite needle exchange program as well. So we are able to invite people into the space, and if they happen to drop off a sample when they're in the space, they happen to drop off that sample. So we get a little creative with it. On the East Coast, drug checking is really like, I think in its emerging stages. In PEI, it's just P.E.E.R.S Alliance that offers it, but in New Brunswick, our friends at Ensemble do as well as Avenue B. So that's really exciting. And I think another one is coming up in New Brunswick as well. And some Nova Scotia chats are happening. So we're the kind of the three coastal provinces on this side. So I'm looking forward to expanding that network and what we're doing. Because I think while we're close in proximity, we're so isolated in what we're seeing in services and what is offered. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tessa. And I'm relatively new to this space. I was welcomed in with open arms to many of these people on the call, but I've learned very quickly that the drug checking world really relies on learning from each other and kind of building upon what you know. And I feel the community it wouldn't be what it is if it weren't for many of you sitting here today. So just want to thank you and appreciate how much passion and dedication you've all lent to this work. So it's truly amazing. Karen, heading over to Ontario, would love to know a little bit about what drug checking looks like in the province there in contrast to BC and PEI.
Yeah, for sure. So I will just maybe start by saying that Ontario, we don't have provincial support for drug checking here in Ontario. So the Ontario government did not participate in the class exemption that was made available to the provinces and territories, which would allow for provinces and territories to provide exemptions. So all of the exemptions for the services that we offer go through the federal government. And also aside from, one-off funding for test strips at various points in time. There is no provincial funding available for drug checking here in the province. So just some important context. But I guess I will maybe just briefly describe our two programs. So that's Toronto's drug checking service and then its provincial expansion, Ontario's drug checking community, and also just mention other drug checking activities that are taking place in the province. So Toronto's drug checking service was one of the first three drug checking programs in Canada, alongside BCCSU's drug checking program and then the University of Victoria's substance program. Since day one, we have been offering what is known as an off-site drug checking model, where samples are collected in the community, but they are actually analyzed off-site at a laboratory using the Tier 3 instruments that Jared referred to. So the way that this works in Toronto is that, we establish collection sites at community agencies throughout the city that have existing and trusting relationships with people who use drugs. Historically, all of those were supervised consumption services, but that's becoming a lot harder here in our province. We accept both drugs and used drug equipment every single day at one of our collection sites. Every single day, we have bike couriers that bike around to our collection sites, pick up the samples, and bring them to one of our analysis sites, where they're then analyzed using either gas chromatography or high resolution liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. And then we're reporting results back out, generally within a day, to the collection site where the sample was collected, where they can be communicated with the service user, or service users also can access their results on our website. So that's kind of how it works in Toronto. Now, our program has been quite successful in, becoming a primary source of information on the drug supply for Ontario and Canada even. So for that reason, we have received additional funding to expand. So currently what we're looking to do and what we're doing is establishing a collection site in each of Ontario's public health regions. There are 29 of them. And it'll essentially the same model. This is offsite drug checking, but of course, we aren't using bike couriers. Ontario is a very big place. So we use commercial courier. So samples may arrive by plane or vehicle. And then for our sites outside of Toronto, collecting samples daily, but samples are transported to our analysis sites weekly rather than daily. And of course, because there's that like longer turnaround time for results, for our collection sites outside of Toronto, this is much more of a drug market monitoring program than it is like individual service delivery. So the only other two things I will quickly say, Ontario is actually incredibly different on the drug checking front than anywhere else in the world, actually, but in particular in North America. So there is on-site drug checking that is happening throughout the province, but essentially nobody is using Bruker's Alpha 2 FTIR or another FTIR, which is the most commonly used instrument for community drug checking. So everybody here in Ontario is either using Scatter's Series 1 or Spectroplasmonics Amplify ID, which are newer kind of in research and development instruments. So many of our collection sites outside of Toronto do have one of those instruments and are using them, but there is also another kind of centralized drug checking project here in the province. It's a research study funded by Health Canada that operates through Western University, and it's placed SCAT Series 1 instruments. So that's a little bit about how things work here.
Thanks, Karen. And I'm going to share very briefly just a health technology review that was completed by Canada's Drug Agency. They did a bit of an evaluation on some of the technologies we spoke about today. And so I'll drop that in the chat in a few moments just so that you have that to look at and you can learn a bit more about the technology, because I don't know about anyone else, but there's lots of big words and big names, and I don't come from kind of a chemistry or a physics or any type of scientific background. So it may be helpful for folks to be able to look through that. I also did want to mention, and I think this probably would have been covered or may have been mentioned by Jared, but a lot of folks don't know that drug checking started in BC at festivals. And so it wasn't always and didn't always look as it does now. It was started by Anchor, which is an HIV/AIDS organization. They were the first to kind of provide those services at festivals, and we still continue to do that. And I know folks here have probably been to one of the biggest festivals in BC, Shambhala, which collects thousands, tens of thousands of drug checking samples every year. And I know folks really look forward to that event, and it's truly kind of the epitome of what the community is, and seeing people come together and volunteer and just be in that space. So it's pretty amazing to kind of see the evolution of where this was back in the 1990s and kind of where we are today. But still, unfortunately, having to kind of fight to keep this practice going. And so really excited that we could host you all to have this conversation. I'd like to move on to our next panel question. So perhaps I'll start with Tessa. I would love to know just briefly kind of what are the benefits you've observed, both for the folks that you serve who access your services, but also maybe the broader community or other people you work with.
Yeah, I think like there are tons of benefits. both to the individual and knowing what they're consuming and being able to monitor that and make informed decisions on their health. But also when we're looking at the broader scope, like David had mentioned previously, it really adds a way of entering into services that people may not have seen themselves in otherwise. Like I know we've had some individuals who don't really identify with using drugs. They're using drugs on the weekend or at a party or recreationally one-off. And they don't necessarily see themselves in those like harm reduction materials programs or someone who would benefit from that or knowing what other services exist. So it really acts as like an entry point sometimes for that's very low barrier. So we can say, hey, yeah, you are just snorting drugs. Did you know that there are other ways to make that more safe for yourself or healthier? Um, I think like I said, we are in this really weird conservative area in our province where people think that someone who is using heroin is going to experience an overdose and not just, a kid partying on the weekend or your great aunt who forgot she's already taken her Dilaudid medication today. So really demystifying, I think, some of harm reduction, but also those other services, whether it is the shelters, the funding, programs that exist, the healthy relationship advice, sexual health, literacy, all of these things can really expand or be accessed just by somebody being like, hey, I have this sample that I want to know what's in. And we've also, like I mentioned previously, have been able to inform other service providers kind of what's going on and allow them to really set up and prepare themselves for what's coming. So when we saw the medetomidine really enter PEI, I was able to reach out to colleagues across the province and say, hey, this is what we're seeing, and this might affect how overdoses present in your space, and some tricks and tips that we've been able to collect from, across Canada or globally on what other services have done that are similar to yours, whether that's clinical or community service. And these are the wins that they've had in the ways that they're responding. So maybe this is something that you can implement. So I think it's been a really cool tool, and it is so much more than just testing that one sample itself.
It sounds like, in addition to, like you say, providing that very essential service of being able to equip people with informed kind of information about what they're consuming and the quantities, it also serves as a very important kind of maybe a first conversation or just an opportunity to build a strong connection with somebody and develop maybe a more trusted relationship with somebody who is in the field and understands kind of what's happening, and then we're able to then perhaps have more ongoing conversations about health and well-being and things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Karen, did you want to maybe share from your perspective, are there any other benefits you want to highlight about drug checking that maybe Tessa hasn't mentioned?
Sure. Yeah. So at one point in time, when we were talking to a potential funder, they asked us the question, who outside of people who use drugs benefits from your data and your program? And at first, I honestly was kind of offended by that question. Like, this is a service for people who use drugs, and shouldn't we only be concerned if it's benefiting them? But actually, that led us to, start asking around to understand who else was benefiting from the information and who else was using it. And that ended up being, hugely beneficial and interesting for our team. So what we learned is that there are many groups that are using our data outside of people who use drugs and those who are directly caring for them at community agencies. So, we heard from clinician groups that the doctors throughout the province that they were actually following our results to understand what was circulating and then using that information to engage their patients in meaningful care and informed treatment. We heard that first responders were kind of following our results as well, and helping to inform themselves about what they may expect when they were showing up at overdose or drug-related incidents. Interestingly, we also started hearing from, like the coroner, the chief coroner in Ontario, and their colleagues told us that they were following our data and then understanding what's circulating in the drug supply was leading them to kind of contextualize trends in in death investigations and kind of the processes for doing those investigations. And same with like some toxicology labs and stuff said that they were changing, which drugs they're looking out for based on our results. So I think, as much as that question initially really annoyed me, I think it was actually really helpful for us to gain a better understanding. And actually, it was, humbling actually to understand how much value there is in the data that we are providing.
Absolutely. And just want to kind of share with folks just to help people understand kind of where and to what extent this data is used. But so Health Canada and federal organizations use this data very often to be able to track emerging trends. At CCSA, we also have a group called the Canadian Community Epidemiology Network on Drug Use, or CENDU. So I'm going to put the link in the chat, but this is a series of sentinel sites across Canada that track different events, harm and risk-related events to substance use. And they also draw upon drug checking data as a very core kind of element of data to be able to do what they do. And then, of course, at CCSA, we use drug checking data often to be able to help contextualize the trends that we see across the country. And Jared, I actually wanted to hear from you as a pharmacist because you bring maybe a slightly different lens to this conversation, but would love to hear from your perspective, kind of what benefits you might see, or if you have anything you want to share as well.
Yeah. Just want to echo what Tessa and Karen had said. Like with drug checking results, like Tessa was saying, like there's an individual impact of just like informing that person right in front of you. So that's like really helpful. Or if you're able to, find an opioid in a non-opioid sample, like fentanyl in a non-opioid sample, like wow, that's a big catch. But then there's the aggregated results, which Karen is talking about, and that can inform like the greater community. And that's really interesting because like, yeah, with drug check or like with drug use in general in the past, it seemed a bit more like less empirical data was out there. It was like, oh, this makes me feel this way. Oh, and so like frontline workers, clinicians, people were hearing these stories, but to be able to refer to quantification data to be like, oh, actually the opioid supply is doing this. And this is like the instruments that was tested to determine that. And that's really informing it. So, like, yeah, I do work a lot in like opioid replacement and safe supply and things in pharmacies and with medical clinics and doctors and stuff. And it's the drug checking results also can inform people just like the relative amounts of opioids that people consume as well. So, a few years ago, there was hesitancy in like a safer supply program to prescribe pharmaceutical fentanyl in the form of like patches or Fentora. And in learning about the drug checking results, and it was translated to morphine equivalence, which is not a perfect system of communication, but it gave relative amounts of like, hey, by the way, like if someone's using street opioids and they're using however many points a day, it equals this many morphine equivalencies, and what's being prescribed with hesitancy because the do no harm approach is like real, which is great, but people like, if that was the street supply, then people are being prescribed a smaller amount and it was just not meeting the needs. And I think the empirical data of drug checking kind of informs the conversation with data and numbers. So that's really helpful. And just a comment too on Karen, it's like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like, funding was shaky like a year or so ago. And it was when there was talks of like not continuing as a project that you got an outpouring of people saying like, hey, we actually use your data, we refer to it, we see your reports and they're helpful. And I think one thing drug checking does, which is great, is put out a lot of public facing reports and we're not always knowing who's seeing them or using them. But yeah, there's an influence out there, so that's good.
And just to comment that someone put in our question and answer box that Toronto Drug Checking Services was one of the first to report on cyclorphene in Ontario, and that this individual uses this data as part of their surveillance report with Health Canada. So just to attest, how far this data goes and how important it is. Before I move on to the last question, I did get a couple of questions here. It might be worth taking a moment to answer them now, but two people kind of asked a very similar question around recommendations or advice around how to talk to community leaders or folks who may not necessarily align with harm reduction or maybe more kind of focused on the other end of the response continuum. How can we maybe have conversations about and get people on board with drug checking? So I don't know if Karen or folks, Tessa, anybody wants to kind of try to tackle that question, but how can we have conversations in a more maybe open and supportive way?
I mean, from my perspective, whether your focus is prevention, harm reduction, treatment and recovery, or community safety, like at the core of those, we need to know what's circulating in the drug supply, right? Like if you want to potentially educate people about substances and potentially prevent them from using them, the way that you do that is by kind of helping to understand helping people to understand the various risks that are associated with using unregulated substances. How do we know what the risks are? Well, we know what the risks are because we either see health outcomes or because we see what's circulating and we know that those are associated with risks. If your focus is on treatment and recovery, how do you retain people in meaningful care and how do you offer meaningful treatment to people? You do so by meeting them where they're at, and you meet them where they're at by understanding what they're using and what's in the supply. So, yeah, I think I don't know how to initiate the conversations, how to get people who don't understand to listen. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But I just think that, I think anytime I talk to people and they really understand what our program is and the important information that community drug checking services generate, it's like I haven't heard anyone be like, "Oh, that's doesn't make sense," or "That's stupid." But it's just being in a position to actually have those conversations.
Anyone want to add anything to what Karen has shared?
I think something that's been very successful for us, and it's not an easy thing to do by any means, is really finding those champions within those systems. I think as much as people can come from very different approaches to the work, especially in when we're working with harm reduction, when we're working with maybe vulnerable folks, or even just like serving the broad community, like something draws us to this work. So if we can kind of find that connecting point and really make it a way that's like digestible or palatable. And I hate to say that because I really hate like watering it down, but also meeting the people that we're trying to inform and educate where they're at as well. So if I'm going to like my great grandfather, my great grandfather passed a long time ago. But if I'm going to someone with that kind of mindset and saying, harm reduction saves lives, naloxone saves lives, all of these things, that means nothing to that person. But if I am going and saying, like, hey, remember when you went to a music festival when you were this age and you experimented with substances? Well, this is what was out there then, and this is what's there now. So if I'm in that situation, don't you think I should know what I'm consuming? Or using something like the bars as very very comparable to a safe consumption site or a liquor store with safe supply, like all of these kind of comparisons that help make them make sense, um, has come a long way. And I think, yeah, if we're finding those champions, whether it's in policing, whether it is in the government, and really just starting those conversations on a one-to-one level, and then really watching that like ripple effect of if we're influencing this circle, they're then going, and then they're going, and they're going. And a lot of the time I find within our area, people just don't have the information. People don't have the information. People are scared. People bring hate to it because they want someone to blame for the things that aren't going their way. So when we can really just demystify it and take that veil back and come at it with that point of empathy, I think it does go a long way. And it is very hard, I will say that. And you will want to rip your hair out. There's no denying that, but I think there is power in it.
Thank you, Tessa. And this actually lends us so nicely to our last panel question. And perhaps I'll start with Courtney. Um, if you could give someone one piece of advice, if they wanted to set up drug checking services in their community, if it's not already established, what would that piece of advice be to that person?
I think I think the biggest piece of advice I would have is to make sure that you are co-collaborating with the community of folks that is and will be using the service. I think developing drug checking services alongside the drug using communities, there's a number of different ones, as we know, and really doing that work and utilizing the experience and expertise of people who use drugs to create services that are accessible and flexible and low barrier for them.
Absolutely, because they know what they need, right? They know
Exactly.
what they want in terms of a culture and environment when they're accessing these services. And truly, it is about them, right? First and foremost, it's about people who are accessing those services. So, David, what about you? I'd love to know what one piece of advice would be that you would have if somebody came to you and asked this question.
One piece of advice is tough.
Yeah.
There's a lot. But I think one of the big things that I have seen happen many times and that has been a challenge in times is we want to jump into drug checking because it's such a valuable tool and a valuable thing. It has to be done slowly and intentionally. And rushing into drug checking without putting plans and structures in place to support its longevity. This is a resource intensive and human hour intensive type of work that we are engaging in. And so I think the biggest thing to be able to build a successful program is to spend that time early, ensuring that the structures are in place, that you have everything you need for this program to succeed in the long run. We have seen it happen many times, even here in BC, where we try and jump the gun. We want to get it going as fast as possible. And ultimately, if we don't have the structures and supports in place, it's not going to be sustainable in the long run. And so, as hard as it is in the midst of an emergency and a crisis that we are dealing with, for BC, we're about to hit our 10-year anniversary since the declaration of the emergency. We still have to make sure that we're doing this intentionally and well so that it serves people in the best way possible. And we don't end up having to withdraw service because we didn't set up our structures well in the first place.
It's the old adage, don't put the cart before the horse, right? We have to make sure and we've thought about sustainability and structure and resources and capacity, because as you said, it is not something you can really do overnight. And it's a service people rely on. And so we wouldn't want to implement that and then not be able to continue that, offering those services once they're there. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I was wondering if maybe Jared wanted to provide one piece of advice that he would give to someone if they asked, they were curious and wanted to get set up in drug checking services.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It really depends who's asking, what the context is, what the intention is behind the service. But I will, I guess, go with like it's nice to co-locate drug checking with other services and to be a part of the community. Don't reinvent the wheel. If there's other harm reduction organizations, they could house drug checking in a nice way and it would be a good value add for them. Collaborating with healthcare workers, with anyone working in outreach, with like, safe supply, with pharmacies that focus on oat, just like tapping in with the community and supporting the community, not trying to be an own isolated situation. Because there's a lot of like we talk about aggregated data and like cool, it's a national thing, but like actually like local community and trends and stuff is really valuable. So just like trying to stay local, I think is would be my advice as well. And tapping in nationally, but local.
Hyper local if we can, right? Like that is really where we're gonna get the meat and potatoes of it all. And we can't lose sight of that. We have national trends and we have provincial trends, but we often miss the local trends, and that's where you're going to see the impact on the community. And truly our national trends can't be that great if we're not, looking to the local level and making sure that those incorporate what we know about the community. So thank you all so much for your wonderful responses today. So our panelists have done a wonderful job at actually going through and answering so many of the questions that were asked. So really there were just mostly comments left, just really appreciated the framing around, this is what this is what the drug supply was then, and this is what it is now, and just thinking through, how do we meet people where they're at? And again, just recognizing that, this group has a lot of knowledge and a lot of resources. And I know David had shared some of the implementation work that they've done. So if people are looking for some actual concrete kind of ways that they can go about getting this started, I'd encourage you to reference those resources and have a look at that, as well as the other things that have been shared. And two, we're going to provide the contact details for our panelists. So maybe Jill, we can hop on over to that slide now so that folks can capture that. It'll probably be a couple more. Yeah, perfect. So feel free. I've already asked permission, but panelists would welcome if you have questions, if you want to reach out. And Jared, thank you for sharing as well the DREAD project work. So you do some excellent stuff there as well, just around covering even in more depth what we talked about today in terms of what drug checking is, the technology, the exemption. So you're going to find a lot of really, really key information there. So Jill, if you'd like to just back up a couple slides for us. If you'd like to give us some feedback on our exceptionally well planned webinar today, again, so gracious for people's patience as we worked through some kinks, but feel free to leave us some feedback on our webinar today. And we are also next month, in May, we're going to be hosting a webinar around the resiliency scale with the P.E.E.R.S Foundation. So getting a bit of information around the brain story and how we can help people kind of overcome adverse childhood experiences and really help them to be able to thrive and really reach their true potential. So we're going to be tackling that in May. So feel free if you'd like to sign up. And with that, I think we will close it for the day. So if you would like to get in touch with myself or my wonderful colleague Chandni, who is not in today, please do capture our email addresses. If you have questions about the webinars, resources, or anything related to the small cities work, please do feel free to reach out. Otherwise, so grateful for your time and your attention today, and a huge round of applause and thank you for our panelists who did such a great job, and just ever grateful for your knowledge, your time, and your friendship. It's so great to know you all. So I hope you folks have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.